George Mason, co-signer of the Declaration of Independence, and one of our founding fathers, once said, was quoted saying, "The best and the most effectual way to enslave the people is to disarm the people." The outright banning of any type of firearm ownership is constitutionally wrong and does not keep the guns out of the criminals' hands. Doubts of the defensive utility of guns usually rest on one of three beliefs. One, that civilians do not need guns because they will never come in contact with a criminal, or at least never come in contact with a criminal within reach of a gun. Two, that civilians do not need guns because they can solely rely on the self-protection of the police force. And thirdly, that civilians, unlike police, are unable to use guns effectively, regardless of need. Although gun ownership costs more than simple measures such as locking doors, not going out as late at night, however, gun ownership does cost less than buying and maintaining a dog, installing a high-tech security system, hiring a security guard, or relocating one's residence to somewhere of less crime. Consequently, gun ownership is a self-protective measure that is available to those who cannot afford more expensive alternatives. There are other, more effective steps that should be taken before the banning of firearms. Today, I would like to dispel these doubts of gun ownership, propose some ways that we can reduce gun misuse, and why the banning of firearms is ineffective. Let's begin with why the banning of firearms is unconstitutional and ineffective. After a 30-year ban in Washington, D.C., the D.C. court, or there's a court in the Federal Court of Appeals, D.C. versus Heller, deemed that the banning of the gun ownership by the federal government is unconstitutional and infringement of American citizens' Second Amendment rights of the Constitution. Associate Supreme Court Justice Stephen G. Breyer, a residing judge of the D.C. Heller case, was quoted saying that violent crime in Washington has increased since the ban took place in 1976. He continued saying that in a comparison of 49 other major cities, that the crime rate in Washington was substantially higher than those without the ban of the handguns. To implement the absurdity of the thought that the firearm restrictions keep guns out of the hands of criminals, Josh Sugarman, former communications director for the National Coalition to Ban Handguns, was quoted saying in the Washington Monthly, "Handgun controls do little to keep the guns out of the criminals' hands." To the belief that citizens will not come into contact with the criminal is unrealistic. The estimates of the National Crime Victimization Survey indicate that 83% of all Americans will at one point in their lifetime come in contact with a violent crime, and by definition come in contact with a criminal. To help dismiss the belief that American citizens do not need guns because they can solely rely on the protection of the police department, consider this. Rarely does even the best trained law enforcement agency arrive at the scene to catch a criminal in the act. However, they usually arrive after the fact, hoping to gain evidence and hoping to track down the criminal to serve them justice. However, this is all too much not the case, as the criminal has already taken the lives of loved ones, taken peace of mind, and taken the comfort out of the victims. Greensboro just recently released a document analyzing the Greensboro Police Department, in which their priority one call response was 7.85 minutes, a time longer than this speech. Thirdly, the majority of law-abiding Americans are responsible enough to carry guns. A responsible law-abiding gun-carrying American has taken classes in which their accuracy has been tested, as well as being skilled in the laws, local and federal laws, about pertaining to guns. They have also applied for the permits in person for a local sheriff's office, has sworn under oath, and has paid fees, has gone through a scrutinizing background check, and deemed responsible enough to carry their gun by the local law enforcement. Gun ownership should not need to have a reason because crime often does not have a reason. According to the Volume 4 of the Encyclopedia of Crime, and punishment, 91% of all crimes committed by strangers are committed outside of the house. A horrific real-life example of this is a real-life example of the effects of suppressing gun ownership is the 2007 Virginia Tech massacre. In 2005, Virginia Tech took a stance against their students and faculty carrying weapons on campus. Sadly, just 2 years later, it was a gun-wielding psychopath who killed 32 people and wounding 15 on the campus. One could only imagine the amount of life that could have been saved if one gun-carrying, law-abiding citizen was there to help. The presence of responsible gun owners is evident. Now let us take a look into how we can keep them safe. Acquiring a license is no effortless task. However, there is a need for implementing more requirements for potential gun owners. Implements such as complete psychological evaluation by a qualified psychiatrist, annual or monthly monetary pledges to local government, and the successful completion of gun safety classes, not just once, but annually. To instill the principles and the power of the principles of the power and the need of responsibility surrounding handguns, gun safety classes should be taught early on to our young adults. Just right alongside the sex and drug education they receive in our public schools, so too should the education of gun safety be provided. Local governments also need to put in reasonable zoning laws, allowing properly built shooting ranges to be built within urban areas, giving the average citizen better access to gun safety practicing facilities and gun safety practicing courses. To conclude, as we have seen, the need or the outright restriction of firearms is unconstitutional. Gun bans alone do not keep the guns out of the criminals' hands, and only through increasing the appropriate requirements to obtain firearms is the only way we are going to reduce gun misuse. With America's gun misuse problem, or if gun possession among prospective victims tends to reduce violence, then reducing such gun possession is not in itself a social good. To disarm criminals in the hope that, or just to disarm non-criminals in the hope that this might indirectly reduce the access to guns among criminals is a very high stakes gamble. Thank you. No claps, okay.